Hi there, I'm Stan Baker, one of the hosts of Circle Forum, along with Shelley Steele and Steve Young. And this week we talk about how to find time. How to find time to reflect. How to find time to reflect on our connections or not with families of students who don't attend school regularly. It's really about priorities and making time or setting the intention to reflect and take time to talk about the school-home connections. It's important because it can help you partner with your most important partner for student attendance, the parents. And if you're currently dealing with lots of students who've checked out and aren't attending school regularly, then this episode is for you because it can help you move connections with parents to the forefront of your school's agenda. So we talk about finding out who's not well connected. Somebody has to come up with a list. Secondly, revise the staff meeting agendas to include input from staff on important issues like student attendance. And take the time yourself to set up a good question for discussion that starts with, how might we, and fill in the blank. At the end of this episode, be sure to visit our website, www.restorative.ca, where you can find lots of great free restorative resources, and make sure you subscribe on YouTube. Now, let's listen into the conversation with Shelley, Steve, and me, Stan. How do we find the time to reflect on parents and families that aren't connected with school? We know connections to school are important, but as a school, we're so busy. How do we find the time to make those kinds of connections and even just reflect on the connections?
So when you're talking about finding the time, you're talking about more than one person. Most teachers sit back and reflect on a family and a child that's struggling, but how, as a team, a school team, do we find the time to sit down together to have a reflection on that family? So where do we find that time to sit down and say, we think this family is struggling. What do you think? And now what are we going to do about it? Let's find some time to create the plan. That's the real struggle these days, is finding that time to have those conversations. I think most people in their minds have an idea of who might be struggling or who, and they might even have some ideas of what to do about it. When do we find the time to sit down as a group to have that conversation, to really focus on a positive plan?
You're talking about connecting the dots a little bit there, Steve, right? I might have this piece of information and somebody else knows this about the family or this about the student. And how do we do that? And yes, the ideal is to have everybody involved with that student be able to come together and come up, make a plan. But what you're talking about is the pressures and the structures are not in place right now to be able to do that sort of thing. I think there's been various models over the years of how to have conversations about students that are in need. And outside of special education discussions or anything of the other kind, the more structured processes that are in place is the in-school team. And again, that can look different based on who's available or what time we have. But at the bare bones of it, it's that a student has been highlighted for whatever reason. And if we're just going to focus on attendance, has been highlighted. And now some people are going to at least have an awareness and some discussion around what supports might be in place or what might be needed. And that information may come from teachers, or that may come from looking at your data to say, this kid's flying under the radar, but he's missing 2 days a week, and it's starting to accumulate.
So I think it starts with somebody actually asking the question, who's not connected? Like somebody has to ask that question. And then I think a lot of times administrators will try and figure out these problems on their own. But I think we need to find ways, whether that's in a staff meeting, to involve, here's the fair process coming up, right? We need to engage the staff in this question. Folks, we have a lot of families that aren't connected at our school. And I've put together a list of families that I don't think are connected, but I'm really wrestling with how are we going to find the time to talk about these? So let's talk about some creative ways. And what are some of the creative things that people have done to deal with that time to get together, to meet, to reflect, to plan for families that aren't connected?
In my working years before I retired, and even a little bit after that, pre-pandemic, we would have monthly staff meetings, and the time was getting whittled away at, for there's so many different things to do in a 75-minute staff meeting once a month. But years ago, we would dedicate time of our staff meetings for a very specific topics, very
Right.
specific tasks to be done. And the first 15 or 20 minutes or the last 15 or 20 minutes, whatever it was dedicated to whatever that task was. And perhaps that's something that administrators could think about is we have our staff meetings. We hope everybody comes to them. We're going to dedicate the first 20 minutes to talking about gathering a list and creating a list of families we feel are in need. And in every staff meeting, you can update the list. You can discuss families that are on it, whatever. It's dedicating some time where everybody's going to come together to that specific task. It could be PA days, although again, we know that time is being pulled at from so many different directions that it's a valuable time, but it comes down to priorities. If this, as a school, this is a high priority, then we're going to put that higher on the list of that time that it is for those meetings.
I think then part of what we're suggesting is if you're in charge of setting up the meetings and setting the agendas, that you actually look at what's on your agenda, because candidly, most of the staff meetings that I've attended have been just stuff coming at me. And it's candidly in our little quadrants, it's all toolbox stuff. Figure out a different way to share that information with people and come up with a central question or topic that really engages people in the conversations, and people will want to be there. Can you imagine a question, even for a 20-minute discussion, that sounds something like this? How can we best engage families that are not connected to school?
Just let that hang there.
And just let it hang. So it's recrafting the agenda, but it's also taking some time to think through a question so that we're actually a bit more conscious of the kinds of questions we're asking in order to get that engagement, expectation, clarity around connecting with families.
Because even after, if you've given it 10 minutes, 15 minutes at a staff meeting, that question will continue to be in people's minds. So they may not have an answer for you or a thought in that moment, but you've now opened that up that you want to hear some thoughts that I can't figure this all out on my own.
You say that, Shelley, immediately I thought I'm picturing a teacher I used to work with who, it's like a lot of things. You're 10 minutes away from a meeting and you suddenly remember all the things you should have said. And this was a teacher that after every conversation in a staffing, the next day she'd come in and say, here's what I've thought about it. And you have a list written out. And you know what? There are those dedicated people out there that will pick up that thread long after the meeting is over and continue with it and say, this is really neat stuff. And they will volunteer their time, if you will. It doesn't all have to be structured time. They'll continue having those thoughts and come to you 3 days later and say, here's another family I thought about, or here's something else we could do to reach this group. Have we thought about this activity as a social event? They'll keep thinking, but you're right, Stan, plant the seed, ask the question, and then most teachers I've worked with, a lot of them will continue that work long after a meeting is over because they're thinking about it.
Now, I know that in former days, pre-pandemic, drop-in circle meetings for teachers, say after school, informal circles that was a way to actually include staff in conversations. May or may not still be possible. One of the things that might be helpful is to actually have an open topic that comes out of whoever's there, and people can come if they want to, they don't have to. But often there are lots of after school discussions that kind of cluster in somebody's room, or the grade 7 and 8 teachers are getting together in that grade 8 teacher's room or whatever. And to just be more conscious about encouraging that and encouraging people when they get together to think about connections with families, connections with students, so that you're shaping, maybe as the leader of the school, some of the conversations, that it's not just, boy, I had problems with behaviors, but what about framing it in terms of how are we connecting with students and families?
In a staff meeting, they'll say what they want you to hear, but in a hallway meeting, they'll just say what's on their mind. They're open.
The parking lot meetings are even better.
Yeah. Parking lots are even better. We always have the parking lot meetings after every staff meeting, or after everything, there'd be a dozen people in the parking lot carrying on the conversation.
That's also where great ideas generate too.
Absolutely.
Right.
Yeah. We used to do that after parent teacher meeting. Like we'd have our school council meetings, and invariably there was a parking lot meeting. I'd walk out and lock the school up at 9:00 at night. There'd still be a dozen parents in the parking lot carrying on the conversation or planning something or whatever. Yeah. Valuable time. And it's all casual time. It's not formally planned, but it's a result of the formal plan
Yes.
of planting those seeds, those questions.
To me, it's actually always sad to have those meetings take place in the parking lot because it means to me that something in the meeting has failed, that people have not felt comfortable bringing those
Absolutely.
concerns
That's what I was
forward.
just
And I think that it's so important to make sure that all of those issues that otherwise might be discussed in the parking lot after a meeting, like the second meeting, like that's just a
yeah.
tragedy. That's just a tragedy.
Sometimes you're right, Stan, it is that, but sometimes it's like I just said before, it's as parents or people are leaving the building, they suddenly think of something that they hadn't thought of before.
Sure.
And it starts the conversation again. But you're right. Sometimes this conversations are squelched. And some of the school councils I've had over the years, some are open-ended and fantastic, and other ones were very controlled by the chair. And I'm sorry, that's not on the agenda. We're not discussing that tonight, kind of thing. Very Robert's Rules of Order. But then afterwards, everybody's out complaining about the chair in the parking lot. And that's where the conversation's about, here's what we really should be doing about raising money for the playground. And that's where it happens, because you're right. It wasn't allowed to happen in the formal meeting, but yeah, quite often it's just simply people suddenly have an idea and they're still thinking, they're still ruminating over things that they've heard and they still want to talk about it. It's good.
Relationships with parents can be challenging and are important for schools, and none is more important than the relationships with parents of children who are not attending regularly. School principals or district staff don't have to go this alone, since every person in school has a role to play in student attendance. We need to help raise the awareness of absenteeism with staff and help clarify each person's role in school. Find out more about our work on absenteeism and restorative practice, www.restorative.ca. Email me, stan@restorative.ca, and let's talk some more about absenteeism, about student attendance, and about building connections with families.